All right, hey everybody, welcome to a special episode with CrossPolitic. When something important happens, we want to talk about it. We want to get the word out. And as you guys are aware of, yesterday a verdict was had in a trial, basically what I call the Nashville 11. Now, I don't think it was all 11 people were got their verdict yesterday. I think it was six of them, but a verdict was had yesterday where it found six. I think it was six. Steve, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, six Christians guilty of violating the federal FACE Act, FACE FACE Act, by singing hymns and in the um, in the entrance of a pro-abortion, a murder mill, an abortion center, and they were found guilty yesterday. So they're pending, I think, sentence. Their sentence is pending for like July 2nd or June 4th, something like that. I can't remember. This summer, basically, is when they're going to receive their sentence. And so I have lawyer Steve Thornton. He actually represented one of the defendants. And of course, we've had Paul Vaughn on the show before also to discuss. If you guys remember when we had Paul Vaughn on the show, man, 6 months ago, I can't remember. Maybe it was this summer, when his house was surrounded by FBI agents with guns and his children, and they basically surrounded and swatted his house and surrounded him and had FBI agents carrying guns on his premise and knocking on his doors and creating quite the scene with his family. Paul was arrested, and his wife didn't really know where he went. He was gone for about 6 hours, or was out of contact for about 6 hours. Well, he was arrested because he was one of the six who were singing hymns and in this abortion clinic, and apparently violating the FACE Act as the federal government has framed it. So I've invited Steve Thornton on to talk kind of about the details about the verdict of the trial and about kind of next steps. And Steve, let's just kind of start over from day one and talk about your client that you represented, what they were arrested for, and then how you got involved in the trial, and then we'll get to the outcome of the trial here in a minute.
My client is a medical doctor who has stood with others outside a abortion clinic in Jackson, Mississippi for years before Doe came along and that clinic was shut down. And so I've known him, represented him as the city of Jackson would, prosecute him for just, a noise ordinance, making too much noise by screaming on the sidewalk, they say. Of course, that's protected by the First Amendment, and we dealt with those. But he traveled to Nashville to have a pro-life rally with friends and like-minded folks. They went to a clinic in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, and there were folks out on the sidewalk. They were, hoping to talk to expectant mothers as they came into the building. As a office building open to the public, had some medical offices in it. It also had this abortion clinic in it, and some of these folks were by the elevator. My client was by the elevator, hoping to greet and meet people getting off the elevator. There are folks that were standing in the hall. There are folks singing and praying, and they're armed with their Bibles. Very that kind of scene, right? So that's what they're doing. And then that day, Paul Vaughn actually did nothing more than just walk between the police who came there, Mount Juliet police, to say, "Hey, you're trespassing because the owners of the business don't want you here," even though the owner of the building never did tell them to leave. But we'll set that aside a moment. So the police there said, "Okay, we'll give you a chance to leave." And most everybody said, we'll leave. There's a few that said, "No, we want to stay," and they're arrested for trespass. And the city of Mount Juliet dropped those charges. And you think that's, the case is over, right? No.
Wow.
The Biden administration, after Doe versus Jackson Women's Health Clinic, had gone after pro-lifers with a vengeance. And to give you some perspective, violent protesters destroying buildings and burning property, they get a pass to the Biden administration, the Department of Justice, and protesters who are vandalizing churches and pro-life centers, they get a pass from the DOJ, Biden administration. But these peaceful hymn singers at an abortion clinic trying to save babies from being murdered, they're prosecuted with, charged with a felony conspiring to violate federal law. And it's not just in Nashville. We have one in Michigan, one in Washington, D.C., and then this third one I'm familiar with in Nashville. So that's where we are as after Doe came along in October of 22, the Biden administration, Department of Justice issued arrest warrants for, there was 11, that's why you call them the Nashville 11. 6 were charged with felonies. They were tried this past week. 4 will be charged with misdemeanors. They'll be tried sometime in the near future. And then there's one young woman who was frightened enough to plead guilty and cooperate with the government. And that's just an ugly situation if you can imagine being betrayed by some of your colleagues in the rescuing babies. But nevertheless, she testified against these folks, and that's how we got where we are, and that's where we are in terms of the trial being held and then a jury verdict coming back.
So you mentioned that they were also charged with conspiring to violate federal law.
There is an old statute from the Civil War era that was aimed at Ku Klux Klanners to say, if you conspire to violate someone's federal right by injury, oppression, or intimidation, that you violate this federal law, and it's a felony, and you can be penalized or sentenced to like 10 years in jail. And in this case, the government, came up with this combination. So the idea is that the Free Access to Clinics Act creates a federal right to abortion services. And so if you conspire to violate someone's free access to clinic, then the federal government can charge you with a conspiracy and the violation of the FACE Act. And you have a misdemeanor charge and a felony charge. And that's what these people faced.
So, but this was after Roe v. Wade was already. So let's clarify some things here. This protest, or what was it called? Hymn sing, or what was it called?
It was called multiple things, but rally was one, and rescue was one.
So this rally, this rescue, happened years ago. How many years ago?
It was in March of 2021.
Okay, and then Roe v. Wade was overturned in
June of 22.
Okay. So wouldn't that render whatever charges they threw at him a moot point?
Well, under Dobbs versus Jackson, Jackson's Health, and Roe versus Wade, and prior Supreme Court cases that held that whenever the Supreme Court makes this sort of substantive constitutional ruling, it has to be applied retroactively. And we filed a motion to apply Dobbs retroactively and say you can say it's moot. They were then considered trying to stop abortions, which were illegal in Tennessee. But our federal judge in Tennessee did not grant that motion. She was a Clinton appointee, and she said no. She wasn't going to believe our arguments, accept our arguments, and so we're prepared to take it up on appeal, but that has to wait until we get a judgment in this case against the defendants.
Because how many responses, how many moot point rulings, or whatever you call them legally, happened during COVID, saying, "Oh, the emergency health orders are now done. We don't need to take up this case anymore because they're passed. But if the emergency health orders come back, we're willing to take up this case again." I know of at least 2 or 3 in my state alone where the judge ruled that way, where they said the emergency health orders are done. We don't need to take up this case. But if the emergency orders come back, then we'll pick it up, and just moot point after kind of thing.
Yeah, but they weren't protesting abortion.
So what was the individual charges? It sounds like there's at least 2 charges. And one was a misdemeanor. That's the FACE Act. And then the other one was conspiracy to commit to violate a federal law. That's the second one. That's a felony. Was there any other charges thrown at them?
Only those 2 against all 6 defendants.
Okay. And then what were they found guilty of now? So this is on Wednesday now. So we had the trial this last week. What were they found guilty of?
Both of those. I mean, that's a travesty itself. But this juror of 12 people from Tennessee, every one of them went along with this shenanigan you called it earlier.
Wow. What do you mean went along? Were they basically coached by the judge on how to rule on this?
Well, that takes us into a lot of history since the founding of this country. John Jay, the first justice of the United States Supreme Court, told the jury that they had the right and the power to decide the law. He said it's a gentleman's agreement between the judge and the jury that the judge tells the jury what the law is, and they decide the facts, and they apply the facts to the law. But
Mm-hmm.
whenever their conscience says that the law is in the wrong, they have the power to say, we vote not guilty because this law is wrong. In that sense, the jury system of our country serves as like another branch of government to hold
Yeah.
runaway wicked governments in check.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the jurors have a conviction, this takes you back to something you've talked about before. We have to obey God's law in every aspect of our humanity, from the way we talk to our wife, to our children, even our thought process and our own words, right? And so if you're sitting on a jury and you know that God's law says that babies is wrong, but your government's law says murdering babies is okay, what is your obligation as a human, really, but as a Christian especially, to do in those cases? And the United States legal system has recognized that is a juror's power, and none of these jurors exercise that power. They were told by the judge, and this is something for the last, let's say, 100 years since the Civil War, judges have told jurors that they don't have the power to decide the law. They must follow the judge's instructions or they violate their oath. That is not consistent with either our form of government, biblical sound, knowledge and understanding. But that's what's been told by federal judges to jurors over and over again. We have some renewed interest, since Rodney King in the understanding that there's times. Now, we don't have any problems telling the Germans that those judges should not have sent those Jews to the gas chambers, right? Even though the law, we don't have any problem telling them that. But applying it to ourselves whenever we have a rabid abortion protecting president and administration, and judges do the same, they don't tell the juries that they have a power to do that. And so this judge, following that pattern, this judge went way out of the way to make sure that nothing hinted at the juror having the power to say no, because even asking the jurors, can you follow my instructions even if you think the law is wrong? And jurors were put on the spot to say, we'll follow your instructions even if we think the law is wrong. That is what I mean by the juror. Every one of the jurors went along with that and did not, I'd say, do their duty to strike down I'll call it an application. When you have a prosecution, you're taking a law and you're putting it in effect against somebody. Even if the law wasn't completely evil, but there's an evil application, though, the juror is faced with real facts. So they decide facts specifically as to you. The legislature might pass legislation that applies generally as best they can tell. But when it gets down to the real nuts and bolts and it's applied to you, the juror gets to decide, is this application of the law just or unjust? And in this case, those jurors all went along with what the judge and the system had set them up for. And we could go into lots of reasons why that is. Public school system, education system, pastors preaching in the pulpit. There's a lot of places we can go with that conversation, but that's what these jurors did.
All 12 vote in favor of charging him with these two crimes.
Yes, in federal court system, you have to have a unanimous jury. All 12 has to vote. If only one of them had voted, said I will not, we'd have had a mistrial and we'd had to start over. But that would have been a statement that at least some member of the jury would say, no, will not do. But they didn't. And they were only out for a few hours deliberating.
Wow. Was it an all pro-choice jury?
Well, it didn't look like that because they didn't look like that. We had information about the jurors. Some of them said they were pro-life, and some of them said they were churchgoers. But if you can imagine,
unbelievable.
Some churchgoer goes to a Russell Moore church, and they think that whatever the government says is absolutely right. So they can be pro-life and churchgoers, and yet still not do their duty in this regard.
You're in the courtroom. Are you able to say to the judge, "Hey, judge, your instructions are wrong"?
I am, and we did, but that doesn't mean she can say you're overruled. And she can even say, if you say certain things in front of the jury, she'll hold you in contempt and discipline you as an attorney. And because she has a power of the federal army behind her, she has quite a bit of power to manage what comes in, what doesn't come in, well, who says what.
What are some of the things that she said were not allowed to be used in this case? Some of the arguments or some of the words?
Well, we would have to get into specifics, many of which I can't remember, but anytime we got close to something that she thought was jury nullification, right? Anytime we got close to something where one of our witnesses would say, I must follow God's law over man's law, the judge said, no, we'll not talk about that. Even to the point we're saying we won't talk much about abortion because this issue is not about abortion. This issue is about access to clinics, access to reproductive health services. And
So
whenever
define the terms of engagement.
well, in the FACE Act defines reproductive health services as including abortion, even though now, after Dobbs in Tennessee, it's a crime. So reproductive health services can include abortion in Tennessee, but she gave the jury instructions that reproductive health services can include abortion. And it's a confusing thing, but that's what's happening.
But she already threw out the retroactive appeal that Dobbs overturned Roe v. Wade.
Well, we filed that as a motion to dismiss the indictment early. So by the time we got to the trial, she'd already ruled that says, no, we're not going to apply Dobbs retroactively.
Yeah. Explain the logistics a little bit for me. I'm kind of a layman in all this, but there's 6 people that were on trial. You're one of the lawyers out of what, 6 lawyers or something? How does that work in a trial like this?
There are two defendants. Cal Zastro was one of the defendants, and my client, Cohen Boyd. Each of those 2 defendants had 2 lawyers. All the other defendants had 1 lawyer in the courtroom. And when you give opening statements, each defendant gets to make an opening statement. So one of the 2 lawyers would make an opening statement. When the government puts a witness up and asks a witness questions, the government had 3 lawyers there, and so they would take turns, divvy up the assignments. And the same way with the defense lawyers, where we had 2 lawyers. Like in my case, I asked some witnesses question, and my co-counsel asked other witnesses questions. And same when you get to closing, 1 lawyer for each defendant will do a closing argument.
What was some of the most egregious things that happened in the courtroom? Whether you're questioning and some interesting information comes out, or they're questioning one of the defendants, and the judge is obviously being biased, or what's some of the egregious moments that happened in the courtroom?
This trial, the facts were pretty straightforward. There was 3. Well, there was 1 abortion clinic worker who did some video recording with her phone. That was brought in. My client did some video recording with his phone. That came in. 2 other of the defendants did video recordings with their phone. Their videos came in. So the evidence of what happened that day was by and large shown on video. So there wasn't much egregious in the courtroom. The jury was looking at the video and being asked questions about, these people. The judge had tightly restricted us talking about the First Amendment rights of our clients. It's not about free speech. Well, it really was about free speech. So we were really limited. So that was a very bad ruling. Again, I said we'll appeal that, but nothing just outrageously egregious. The judge, I have to compliment on her on letting the defendants once she narrowed the range down to where you couldn't talk to the jury about God's law being superior. She was pretty reasonable in letting the defendants put on evidence, cross-examine witnesses, listening to our position on jury instructions. That I can't fault this judge for. And the jury, of course, they sat and listened.
Mm-hmm. So, what's next? Obviously, some appeals here. When you appeal, what happens?
Yeah, well, there'll be a sentencing in July, and then there will be a time for appeal, and we'll appeal, and we'll take it up to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. You've probably heard talk about that. There are 11 in the United States. And above the trial courts, we have a federal trial court system. They're called district courts. Above that are courts of appeal. They're divided into circuits. Nashville is in the Sixth Circuit. We'll go up to an appeal to the Sixth Circuit. And if the Sixth Circuit doesn't agree with our positions, there are lots of reasons why this case would be a good case to go up to the Supreme Court and apply Dobbs retroactively like it should be. And to deal with the FACE Act, now that abortion can be criminalized in states, FACE Act becomes a really strange law.
Mhm.
Of course, by then, if our advocacy prevails, we can have the FACE Act repealed,
Yeah.
which it should be repealed.
Yeah. Will some of these people go to jail until everything's fully repealed?
That will be in large part up to the judge. She will decide what their sentence will be. There's these factors she considers. They're aggravating factors, they're mitigating factors. She'll decide if they get 10 years or 1 year or no years and only probation or supervised release or whatever. And then there'll be a decision by her whether or not she will stay that pending the appeal.
Uh-huh.
If she doesn't
Uh-huh.
stay, then I mean it's possible if they got, let's just say it takes 3 years for an appeal to work through an appeal to the Sixth Circuit to work through a system. If a defendant got 3 years of jail time, they would serve their jail time before the appeal. And let's suppose it got to the Sixth Circuit and it was reversed. Talk about
Wow.
a robbery of your rights. You have served 3 years of jail. Your verdict is overturned. Your guilty verdict is overturned, and you serve jail anyway. And there's no remedy. Like, so what? Now
Oh.
there's one possible, let's say, not saving, but it's a benefit. If there's a certain man got elected president and um, pardoned these defendants for this egregious miscarriage of justice,
Yeah.
then we may get some relief sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Right. Right. How
I
many
say that,
cases? Go ahead.
I say that only because I'm inclined to believe that certain guy would be very much inclined to pardon people who are politically persecuted using the justice system.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. 100%. How many of these cases are going on? So basically, what happened is the city of Juliet. You can correct me where I'm wrong here. They never charged these people, and whatever charges they did, they dropped the charges. And then year or two later, the federal government, Roe v. Wade ends, and the federal government, Biden administration's like, I'm going to make an example out of the pro-lifers who are, in his mind, ruining Roe v. Wade.
No need to correct you. That's good.
So that's what happens. That's what's happening, is what you're saying.
Yes, that's
How
what's happening.
many how many people are going to trial under these circumstances that
You
you
know,
know?
well, I know there has been a trial in Washington D.C. and we had a jury in Washington D.C. which the demographics I wouldn't put as much hope in a jury from Washington. Maybe I shouldn't, but I would put more hope in a jury from Tennessee. But it didn't pan out. But I know there's a case in Washington D.C. where there's a 70-year-old grandmother now, and she was sentenced to, I think, 6 months in jail. And so she is sitting in jail. That's right. And she's been put in solitary confinement. She's been, her rights are being abused, but she's sitting in jail because she stood in the hallway of an abortion clinic in Washington, D.C., and hoped to talk to young women coming to her to get an abortion. That's the quality of the justice coming out of the Biden administration. So I know there's that one in Washington. I know there's one in Nashville. I know there's one in Michigan. How many are in Michigan? I don't know the number.
How how do you um, how do you disbar or get rid of these judges, or what legal remedies do you have for the obvious kind of, I don't know, racketeering, or I mean, I don't even know the legal word, but the obvious intentional persecution using legal plays against conservative Christians?
Well, we have built into our system all these sorts of checks and balances. Let's start with the prosecutor. The prosecutors have an obligation to say no. If you were, especially a Christian, every prosecutor, especially a Christian, if some government official says, please prosecute this case, some police officer, some federal official, Homeland Security says, prosecute this case, a prosecutor can say, no, I'm not going to do that. And they have discretion to say, no, I'm going to do that. And they do that because they said, I know what God's law is and I know what that is, and that's evil. I'm not going to do it. That's the first check and balance. Then you have a check and balance of the judges. This judge could have dismissed these charges way back. A judge who says, I'm not going to permit that, in my courtroom. I'm an Article 3 judge. Once I'm installed, I'm in there for life. I'm not going to do that. There's so many ways those judges can protect your rights as a Christian American from this sort of thing. So they're another check and balance. The jury, we talked about that a moment ago. The jury is a check and balance. The jury check and balance. Now, well, let me go one more. The real culprit, one of the real culprits, is your congressmen and your state legislatures. There are thousands of laws that steal your rights every day. Okay, and whenever the prosecutors or the judge or the jury are dealing with a law, one of the places we should look first is to the Congress and to the state legislatures who are passing these laws. So, Christians should know, the positions of these candidates to know whether or not they are going to respect God's law in terms of what they vote on. And we can go through lots of these rights abusing laws that we live under that should be repealed. So they're the culprits. Then we can talk about the pastors who are not teaching their congregations how to deal with them. I deal with Romans 13 sword bearer, how they deal with that. Then in terms of a political process and judicial process, the impeachment process is really the vehicle for judges. But my goodness, you have a long way to go before people understand how judges abuse their positions. And then you've got the electoral process. The prosecutors at the federal level are under the executive branch of government. So the president has so much control over that. And you might remember, I think when Trump was first elected, how there was a group of U.S. attorneys that were, I think, asked to resign, and they were making all this noise as if they were mistreated by the commander in chief of the armed forces, who has the executive branch, who has the power to ask for the resignation.
Yeah, right.
So there are various processes you can employ, but impeachment is one, election process is one, knowing the candidates, probably the most important, and you won't need to hear this, but probably the most important is for you, me, and your listeners to read the Bible and know what God says about it. And I refer to somebody that I respect a good bit. His name is Joe Boot. You know him. He was talked about the Old Testament laws being a paradigmatic example that will teach us how our laws should look.
Yeah.
So there's
very good.
Long answer to your question.
No, that's very good. Could the governor, like the president can pardon? Can the governor pardon?
The governor can pardon for state offenses, but this one is a federal law.
Can the governor tell the feds to get out of your state? You aren't trying my people on these facetious grounds or whatever.
They tried that once before in the 1860s.
Yeah, well, that's about where we're heading.
And then we very well could be, but it depends on the quality of your governor. Yes,
yeah,
quality of your governor. But yes, individuals need to know where and when to stand, and that's why they need the podcasts like yours, the guidance of their good quality pastors.
How's your defendant doing? How's he thinking about this whole situation? It's got to be pretty weird.
Well, if you think emotionally, like I'm going to be rescued by the jury, then you'd be really devastated. But my client has said, this is in God's hands, and I know, like Joseph was thrown in prison unjustly, and he rejoiced in that time, and God blessed him, and look how God used him. Daniel was taken away from Jerusalem unjustly, and he served his time in Babylon, and we know his story. The 3 Hebrew children. So my client has said, I'm rejoicing, trusting that whatever God does, it'll be to His glory. Yeah, he may. Mr. Dr. Boyd may have to suffer some pain, but God is in control, and glory to God. And that's how he left the courtroom. And my co-counsel was is not quite as steeped in this as I am, was a bit surprised at our client's reaction.
Praise God. Praise God. Where can people follow up, pay attention? How can they follow you, or follow this case, or follow you said it's July 2nd is where the next hearing is?
Some are July 2nd and some are July 3rd. It's a sentencing hearing. To be precise, okay. It's called a sentencing hearing at July 2nd and some are July 3rd. And I don't really have a way, I'm not in this world you're in, but they can listen to you, of course. They can look at some news outlets that we can have some confidence. We need to remind our owners of these news outlets to not follow the paths of CBS and NBC. If they're successful, don't lose sight of what got them there and what their ultimate judge is going to be. So be faithful in reporting accurately, honestly, And yes, we do see the world through the perspective as a Christian. And who else is more objective? I argue, but
Yeah.
that's another argument.
Amen.
But yeah, just watch the news and find a news source that's reliable.
Steve, thanks so much for coming on CrossPolitic. Appreciate your work that you're doing there. You work with our good friend Davis Yuntz. Y'all are part of the same law firm. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not part of his law firm. I'm like a consultant to his law firm.
Okay. Okay. And
Somebody close to me does work with him, and so we
yeah,
like Davis.
your son,
Son-in-law.
right?
My
Yeah,
son-in-law.
son-in-law.
Yeah,
There
we,
you
we
go.
like
Okay.
we like Davis a lot, and I'm at his. I told him I'm at his service.
Okay. Very good. Well, thanks for all your work on that. We'll be praying for July and then the appeals process that's obviously coming.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. Make sure you follow the story. Be praying for what's happening in July. Be paying attention to these cases. There's more happening, like Steve already mentioned, in Michigan and in DC. And so be praying for these cases, and especially as you're able, help fund these Christians fighting this wickedness. I mean, the Biden administration really does want more power, and they are. You've seen this at the border where they're kind of creating chaos to get more power. And this administration is doing very wicked things in the courts against our people and against Christians, particularly in this whole FACE Act charade. So thank you for tuning in. Make sure you share the show. Make sure you put pressure on your legislators. There's some action that Steve kind of laid out for you, and make sure you can take action. So thank you for joining and tuning in to CrossPolitic, and we'll see you guys in the real studio in the show later. Lord bless.